Yes, one second, just to set up. Okay. Okay. I'll start. Oh wait. Okay. Yes. Okay, I'll start in three, two, one, go. Disillusionment hurts, leaving hurts. We believe that the most important thing is the relief you feel the moment that you read something that relates to you, but also tells you things are going to be better. I'll begin with characterization about like what a religious person is going to look like, a person who is disillusioned. First of all, Christianity is most likely going to be the most fundamental part of your you yourself, the way that you perceive yourself, how you define yourself, and the people who are around you. You generally live through Christianity, you follow its rules, and you make a lot of sacrifices that are tied to it. Second of all, being disillusioned in general hurts. I would put a lot of details into that, but it's something that pushes you to question yourself intricately and to a very deep degree, primarily because of the sacrifices you've been ready to make. And third of all, being Christian in general, actually, yeah. So in general, what is going to be the main thing that we're going to argue? We primarily care about relief. You are already feeling bad, you're disillusioned, meaning you're questioning a key part of yourself. Therefore, we believe that the main thing that we should care about is what makes things at least slightly better. So, the second thing that I want to talk about is that disillusionment in general lives in like two general planes. First of all, it really hurts to feel it, primarily because it is such a fundamental thing of yourself that you're questioning. You have to continuously judge yourself for feeling it. Whenever you interact with Christian narratives, whenever you look at the world through the frame of Christianity, and like you feel then disillusioned. It is like it is a frame in your mind that intricately just breaks apart, and you can feel those breaks occur. On the second plane on which disillusionment exists is the thing that it pushes you towards. So, for instance, even if disillusionment is successful, if another team tries to argue about like leaving or whatever, Christianity or something, and that being potentially good, we are going to argue the opposite. Leaving hurts even more. You sacrifice, like you've made immense sacrifice in terms of the good life that you live, like having fun moments, drinking, partying, or whatever, in order to be a good person. And these are general sacrifices that have probably led to like friendships and families falling apart, or other aspects of your life which do not look as nice just on as a facade in comparison to others. Second of all, you no longer have a value system to which to cling to. It is not to say that it is impossible to form one, but the moment at which it disappears, it is an incredibly big hit, primarily because a value system is something that allows you to know whether the decisions that you're making are likely to be true. So the moment at which you're so disillusioned to the point where you leave, it hurts so much because you don't even know if what you're doing is right. So thirdly, you perceive your life decisions as generally wrong the moment at which you're pushed to leave. Primarily because the moment at which you leave, it means that all of these decisions in the past that you've made that are shaped by your religiosity are just generally wrong. So you generally just feel like a failure. So the better poem in this case is whichever one is actually reaffirms your belief, actually pushes you to believe more, because belief and believing that what you believe is true is something that makes you feel better because you don't feel the negatives of actually having to go against your belief. So specifically, why does the first poem make you feel to a degree better? First of all, you relate to it. It mentions explicitly the ways that you feel in a cage, the color by which you're like being carried or whatever. It expresses these very explicit feelings that a person feels the moment at which such an important part of their lives kind of becomes under a question mark. And so the moment at which you see that, you feel nice because it is an experience that is very explicitly represented. The second poem is not as relatable because you relate to the feeling of questioning, but it is not in the sense in which it directly expresses the charged feelings in which you're probably going to have within yourself, the anger, the guilt, and like the general like anger you feel towards God. Second of all, it strengthens your general perception of religion. The poem powerfully ends with the idea that at the very end God comes to you and you know that he exists and you accept God's presence. meaning that the moment at which you read it, you have a poem in front of you that reaffirms the idea that even though, and I guess something that is incredibly pivotal here is that the moment in which you're disillusioned, you feel bad about the very fact that you feel some form of disillusionment. You feel guilt. You start to question yourself. You judge yourself incredibly intensely. So the moment at which you have a poem which affirms the idea that a person who questions God so intensely can still see God is something that makes you feel much better because it makes you not feel guilty about the fact that you've done so to begin with. It actually tells you that your feelings are valid. It actually tells you that however charged these feelings are, you're still capable of seeing the one thing that you've always dreamt of seeing. And this is something that intensely makes you feel better about your worldview and about the life that is around you. But here's the thing. What are the general problems which reveal themselves with the second poem? It is primarily because it's like you only have two situations the moment at which you decide to fully agree with the second poem. First of all, like you either have to believe that God comes only at the moment at which you suffer, because there are moments at which we talk about like God is stimulated by the suffering. I don't know if it's a direct quote, but that general idea, or the darkness or whatever. And so like if you're to agree with the poem, you either have to agree with the fact that it only comes if you suffer. So you have to reaffirm the fact that you're suffering and that your suffering is an unavoidable part
UI.
of your life and something that you need to, yes.
You say that in the second poem, God only comes if we suffer, but in the first poem, God only comes when we're raving and angry at him. So is this not symmetric?
No, it's not symmetric. The primary thing is about the way that you feel the moment in which you express these feelings. You're raving, you're angry because that is the natural response to disillusionment, because you feel the fact that there's something that is in there within you is actually starting to vanish. So the moment at which God comes to you, this is validity that you feel. It is not in the second poem, you still feel the disillusionment. You still relate, I guess, to the darkness which you experience in your life, but but you're still pushed to the general idea that God is still an illusion, that this is something that will persist. So you either have to believe that God is an illusion, or the fact that your suffering is the only constant which exists within this debate. So at that moment, like your only two situations in this case are is either to believe that, or to fully disillusion yourself with the idea that this is an illusion and experience all of the negatives which we gave to you. So these reasons are not symmetric. So the primary idea in this case then is that the moment at which we have something that tells you that your feelings are valid and everything that you're experiencing is okay, and that religion could be true, you're always going to feel better than something that tells you it's an illusion. Thank you.
Thanks, PM. Now, hello.
Okay, cool. Ideally, I would like to take my POIs verbally around the 4 or 5 minute mark. I'm not looking at the chat for POIs. A few pieces of setup before we get into the OO case. Firstly, what does the representation of God look like in their respective poems? In the Collar, the individual is able to return to God after struggle and limit and disillusionment because they're acknowledged by God. Under Vespers, you choose to see God. You do not rely on a message from God in your toughest times, but you can choose your relationship with God. And if you see God, as per the poem, when they tell you that you choose not to look up, you see the sun painting the pasture as a field of fire, and you choose to believe it is a sign from God. But you do not believe that it is necessarily a divine like acknowledgement. And I think that you likely still believe in God as someone who has been raised Christian their entire life. You've likely been to church. All of the people around you are Christian. And so likely the kind of self-actualization we're seeing in this round is probably going to be one in which the individual is able to reaffirm the relationship with God. What then is the OO case? We're firstly going to tell you how people internalize these poems. Secondly, on why it is more fulfilling to believe that God is more distant. And thirdly, why struggle is actually not rewarding. Firstly, then on how people internalize the poems. Instead of living and dying by the poem, you likely internalize the core takeaway message on either side, and this influences how people view interactions with themselves, with the church, with God. I.e., that you likely have maybe the same interactions on both sides, but the interpretations and what you choose to do are likely going to be different based on what you choose to believe in based on these poems. Why then is it more fulfilling on our side to believe that God is distant? The first thing that the poem tells you to do is that you can find your own way and you can choose when to believe in God's presence. This is far more achievable than the counterfactual. Many things are interpretable in many, many different ways. For example, within the poem, you have the feel the fire from the sun's light, and you do not need to see this as a sign from God because you do not look up and wait for a message, but you take comfort in choosing to do so and acknowledging that you're choosing and making the conscious decision to do so. When you internalize the poem in this manner, you are no longer seeing everything as a potential sign from God or waiting to find one, but the primary thought is actually finding your own way. For example, if you are going through a very difficult time of struggle or your life is just not good, I don't know, and maybe like, I don't know, the moon later, the moon is really pretty tonight. You can choose to see this as a sign from God and take comfort that you're choosing to believe that God is there with you, but this is not necessarily this is not what necessarily your condition or your beliefs hinge on our side of the house. But I think that secondly, God being distant also means that you just get better self-actualization on our side. Firstly, you cannot rely on God any longer to tell you what to do or what is religiously correct, i.e. that when you believe that God is more distant on our side of the house and that you are able to believe in his presence or not, you are less subject to things like moral obligations and the absolute divine word of the moral teachings if you do not believe that he is constantly watching you and testing you and will only acknowledge you if your faith is reaffirmed or if you listen to scripture at the end of the day. This means then that people are more able to do things that are conventionally maybe not seen as, like moral under the church, which is particularly relevant for, I don't know, that like younger people or this generation, given that, I don't know, drinking is immoral, being gay is immoral, whatever. But I think that secondly, you just get less fear of punished by God if you lose faith. That when, God is no longer testing you to see that if you will come back to him after, your period of struggle and disillusionment, you're more free to do what you actually, think is best for you. But thirdly, you spend less time waiting for things to get better and for God to fix things and affirm your belief. What does this mean? This means that on our side of the house, you are able to follow your core principles, but the moral obligations and what you should do in times of grief and crisis are now within your own control. This means that you take more concrete actions to self-actualize when you internalize the fact that God is no longer watching everything you do and will come to you, inevitably at the end of the day. This means then you can do things like find religious actions that work for you if you are feeling disillusioned. Instead of going to the church every Sunday and feeling disillusioned by how your pastor is preaching hate speech, you can now choose to individually pray to God every day and feel much more fulfilled in taking comfort in his presence in your own way of choosing rather than what scripture tells you must do, which means that you feel much better because you're now able to adapt your relationship with God in a way that is more personal and feels more proximate to you. But thirdly, you're able to now just redefine a better relationship with God. When you are no longer dependent on his approval, you stop believing that scripture is the only way to self-actualize, meaning that, and this is the mechanism for how we are able to have people take more concrete actions to better their own lives. Why then is struggle not rewarding on government side of the house? Caller tells you that you will hear God calling out to you at the end of the struggle, meaning that you will internalize that there is a payoff or acknowledgement at the end of the struggle, regardless of how you feel or whatnot. I think this is incredibly bad because waiting for a sign from God is unlikely to occur and to reaffirm your belief in religion, i.e. that many, many things that people seek comfort in God from are left to random chance, i.e. that many people pray to God, and hope that their mother recovers from cancer and pray that God will give you a miracle. However, no amount of prayer will objectively change these, similar instances like this. As a result, it feels far worse on their side when things do not get better and you do not hear the voice of God regardless of what you do. Yes, go ahead.
You say no amount of prayer will ever change anything. How do you know this? Please structurally prove it in your speech.
I'm okay, low-key. Anyways, it feels far worse when things do not get better, i.e. that God does not come to you in your darkest time and, relieve your struggles. Your mother does end up dying of cancer and you feel betrayed because God was not here to speak to you or to save her. It further shakes your belief in religion and its foundations, and this is incredibly detrimental to you as an individual because up until this point, you have lived your life believing in religion. You have had your moral values guided by scripture and strive to do well according to what the Bible tells you. You go to church, you pray, you live life according to the belief that God is there and you will go to heaven. And this has been what has given your world meaning for many, many years, if not your entire life. When you further lose faith in religion, this is objectively horrible for your worldview because now you're ideologically homeless at whatever age you are. You feel like all your belief and faith has been for nothing. And this leaves you bereft of something that will give you meaning in your life. I think on our side, the weighing is relatively simple. I think GovBench kind of relies on, the many, many uncertainties or variables, meaning that will ensure that the miracles do happen. This is incredibly uncertain, and there are instances where if you pray, your mom will still die. There are instances where, I don't know, you will still lose your job. And I think that this is something that is incredibly certain. On our side, you get the ability to choose to take your life into your own hands and redefine your relationship with God. And this is an incredibly certain impact because this is up to the individual, that they can certainly choose what they want to do with God. I think just on the basis that our impacts are far more certain and theirs are just, I don't know, more dubious, I think that, we would be much happier on our side of the house oppose.
Thanks, Elo. Now DPM.
Second. Am I visible and audible?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna take my POIs in chat. Please also state your team when you're giving the POI. Just give me a few seconds to like arrange my notes. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First, one additional line to characterization. Note that in order for you to feel disillusionment, you have to care deeply about your religion. What I mean by this is you likely are going to have read the scripture, you're going to have likely been in the church. Why is this so? Because the moment that you do not care deeply about like your connection with God and about how like closely God intervenes in your life, or if you don't care about strictly like following like tradition or like whether God exists or not, like whether you're not like very, very religious, disillusionment cannot happen. Meaning that the fact that God perhaps does not exist, or you're not certain anymore that he does exist, that does not phase you entirely. You're just fine with kind of socially performing the fact that you're Christian and going to church and all of those things because that reaps you some kind of social benefit, but you do not feel like personally about whether he exists or not. This note panel magnifies our impacts to a significant extent, meaning that you just have like a very deep personal ingrained relationship with God and his existence that is very important to be affirmed. And my first speaker already explained this to you. Like, it is very important for God to be able to call you child even after you have kind of doubted him in that particular way, after you have been angry with him, because the church, like the narratives in the church that you have to be all devouting, place all of this sort of pressure on you for you to never deviate or stray for this sort of path. So this is like a huge alleviation of suffering that you're experiencing now. And like, okay, so now I need to explain to you definitively the comparative. So what do like opposition characterize to you? So on their side of the house, they tell you, oh, you just kind of form a more kind of like personal relationship with God in our poem, and you will just believe that like you choose when he comes to you, you choose all of these things. Note panel, something like illustration. I would like to believe in God. I believe there are a lot of benefits of believing in God. For example, I avoid like existential struggle or existential questioning, but I cannot believe in God because I recognize that is a conscious choice that my brain is trying to trick me into. I recognize this is something that is not inherently ingrained in me. I don't believe that this entity exists, although I would like to do so. This is essentially what is happening on the side of the opposition. The poem strictly tells you you're no longer a child. You can afford yourself to be immersed in this illusion. The thing is, the moment that your brain recognizes that this is a logical operation, this is something that you do in order to save yourself as like a protection mechanism, and this is not something that is outside of your control, and it's not something that's like sort of like magical and wholly holy and divine, you lose all of the benefits of religion. Like the moment that you think that you can choose when to see God, you lose all of those benefits. They say, okay, God does not survey you all of the time. So the moment you believe this, what kind of benefits do you lose? First of all, you lose the benefit that you think that you're always protected, meaning that you don't know if God is looking over you. You don't know if he's like sort of guiding your path. You don't know if he's forcibly choosing you to go the right way that will bring you the most amount of happiness, which is a big part of Christianity. It's a big existential question that like Christianity solves. It tells you, okay, God has something picked out for you, and He's constantly step by step guiding you towards that thing. This is something that they lose on their side of the house. Second of all, you lose that opportunity of hope. Note that you still illusion yourself, but just on our side of the house, rather than the comparative, you don't note that consciously. Your brain is likely as a defense mechanism to make you see or start hearing things or something. This is even like in bigger cases called like a religious psychosis. The moment that I'm grandly suffering, the moment that my brain cannot cope with my own grief, it is likely to start making up factors to like kind of get me out of the situation. And when I already exist within the Christian framework, that thing is very likely going to be God. So my brain can stop feeling like helpless in that sort of way. Note like your mother has cancer. Okay, you feel like you don't have control over the situation. You feel helpless. Those are very bad emotions. Your brain tries to get you out of that situation. It copes you out with God. It says, okay, God exists. Okay, God is like helping you, and that sort of thing. And so in that way, your brain kind of makes up these images and those illusions. But the moment, note that you consciously know that this is happening, you will be always able to point it out in your mentality. You will always be like, oh, okay, this is actually not God coming to me. This is not actually like holy intervention. This is not this magical thing that is going to alleviate my pain and fix my life. This is actually something that I'm just telling myself to feel better. Note another like intuition pump. The moment I don't like myself and I feel ugly, it doesn't matter how many of my friends come to me and tell me I'm the most beautiful person in the world, or how many times I repeat to myself in the mirror that I'm the most beautiful person in the world. I will never believe it, because intrinsically that is not the way that my neurological pathways, no thank you, are sort of wired in this particular way. Second, but even if we leave the best characterization of like, oh, which is just like that God is not always watching over you, some other benefits you lose is like divine judgment, for example. The moment that God is not constantly watching over you, you're not sure that you will be judged correctly and you will go to the correct afterlife, for example. Or you're not sure that the people who have wronged you or assaulted you are gonna get their like divine punishment and that sort of thing. And the benefits they give to this point is that you can like adapt your relationship with God and decide to stray from your church. First of all, notice that this is entirely ununique. Your relationship with God does not depend on your relationship with the church. The moment I have faith in my God, I can personally decide that regardless of whether God is distant or not, that the scripture or my church is not describing God in the most favorable way possible. This is to me entirely uncontingent on the poem. But second of all, why it is unlikely to happen for you to believe in this way is that you've already been like kind of under the church dogma, and you've already like internalized that very deeply, and it will be very, very difficult for you, and you will lose a lot of connection and social power in this way. So this impact is just very unlikely to happen. Thank you, vote opening government.
Thanks, DPM. Now DLO.
Okay. I'll say POIs verbally. Probably around 5. Okay, firstly, I'm going to introduce a new point of argumentation on why the second poem is a better poem that you will internalize better, because its formal elements are better. And I think this is something which matters in the round and which is prior to all of the benefits which OG is talking about. And then I'm going to discuss the clashes in terms of relief and your faith in God. Why is it that Vespers is a better poem that you are more likely to connect to than the other poem? A few reasons. The first is that the language is more accessible. If you are a Christian in 2025 struggling with religious disillusionment, when you are looking for poems and when you are looking for art and media which responds to you, you want to be able to understand it in a comprehensible way. The language in Vespers is modern in nature. All of these words are common in the current vocabulary. This is not true of the Caller, which has archaic, dated language, which like through the use of thy and thou, but moreover, because it uses words in ways which reflect archaic meaning. So for example, the as store, where store means like bounty or quantity, or the way sigh is used to refer to like loss or age, which is not the current meaning, right? So in terms of your ability to parse the poem, you can parse Vespers much better than you can parse the first poem. This is the reason you will like it more. The second mech is that it has a more accessible form. Vespers is characterized by literary enjambment. Enjambment is a formal element when a sentence carries on to the next sentence, which means that the flow of Vespers is much clearer and cleaner and faster, it's clearer and cleaner than the one in the Caller, which is quite clunky because it lacks this formal element. And this means that you are able to more easily read Vespers and therefore more easily internalize it. I would also say that the imagery in Vespers is better, which is to say the imagery in the Caller is dated and reactionary and cliche, like the thorn with blood, like the tied to a, this is just like Jesus imagery, which is quite tired, quite lame, which you've seen a billion times in the church, right? And so you are probably looking for a new response. You're looking for new forms of art. And so I think this means that you will respond much better to the second poem. You probably enjoy it more because of these formal elements. Moreover, I think that the first one is very self-tortured, right? You're comparing yourself to Jesus when you talk about striking the board, when you talk about losing the cordial fruit, letting blood with the crown, i.e. the crown of thorns. And I seriously doubt whether the person we're talking about is going to be viewing themselves in such a self-important lens where they think that comparing themselves to Jesus is like something that will resonate with them. I think that the combination of this sort of self-aggrandizement, but also the sort of self-flagellation, which is to say the metaphors of deprivation, thirst, hunger, and pain are unlikely to resonate with you. Why is it the case that these metaphors are unlikely to resonate? I think that the people who opt out of the religion or who are disillusioned with the religion are the case because they don't like the narratives of suffering and self-flagellation which are pushed in Christianity, which they doubt that this is beneficial or positive, right? And so when it is that you are faced with this sort of reminder of the traumatic experience of growing up under Christianity, where you constantly reminded of suffering, what you experience is not relief, but what you experience is a further disillusionment with the religion that you identify with. I'll take the POI.
Yes, about the point about language, that is a little bit confusing to me because you're already religious, you're already reading the Bible, which already uses this kind of language.
Yeah, so the average...
It's like it's dated, but if you relate to it because you're religious and you care about it, we mechanize this.
So the average person who is Christian in 2025 is not reading the 1638 version of the Bible, right? They're reading modern language versions of the Bible, and they identify with it much better. I think it's quite clear that even if there are good messages, you're not able to internalize them. And I think this just means that OG auto loses. Okay, lastly, in terms of like the material on belief and God being distant, I think that Rose gives you a really important piece of characterization, a really important argument in this round, which is that viewing God as more distant allows you to self-actualize in ways which are good for you, right? I think on either side, there are reasons you're going to doubt. I'm sure that there's a heap of media which will like be portrayed to you and be shown to you. And I'm not sure that OG can access their impact in terms of like this being a margin on leaving the religion or not, because there's also other reasons you'll doubt, like the presence of atheism, secular society, the increase of doubt that you will have when you're an adult versus when you're a child, because you question things more as an adult than a child, which will all mean that like you cannot resolve tensions merely through the poem that OG is talking about. So if you cannot resolve these tensions, then the better option is to live with them. And because we capture this authentic uncertainty in our poem, which is to say that the Louise is not sure if God exists, but chooses to see God in the sunset, right? This enables you to preserve somewhat of a good relationship with God, which you can define on your own terms. Let's just say you don't have to define it in terms of suffering, in terms of guilt. You can define it in terms of the ways that in which you see God and choose to pursue God. But it also means that you're able to pursue more activities, which is to say, if you internalize the poem of Vespers, this means that you are able to see yourself as a free person, whereas the collar is literally an analogy for slavery, right? You are collared by God. So I think that in terms of your own perception of your self-agency and what you were able to accomplish in life, when you view God as distant, and if you like this poem better, that means you'll probably read it and then over time internalize God as more distant. This means that you can accomplish more things in your life without fear and shame that God is necessarily watching you, or that your relationship with the divine is necessarily going to be one of suffering, and that you can't define it in other ways which are more positive and constructive and self-made. I think all of this is very much able to defeat the material out of OG. So I guess I'll just do some like more weighing and stuff. I think the imagery that comes out of Vespers is cooler and more fun. Particularly, there is a juxtaposition of two contrasts, which is to say, you have the light and darkness contrast, which is superimposed onto the height contrast. And I think this is interesting because of the evocation of the divine. We associate the divine with both of these sorts of juxtapositions. And so navigating that is something which is likely to appeal to you. I think that your emotional response to the poem and what you think about the poem is quite important in this round. And it is prior to like the effects of internalization which occur downstream of that. I think that because out of opening, we're like opposite only side to address the like formal mechanisms of the poem and how they affect meaning onto the reader, I think we are much better able to access these sorts of terminal impacts. And for all of those reasons, we're proud to oppose.
Thanks, Diallo. Now, Member Gov.
Hi, can I be seen and heard?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. In a world of God and men, it is the mice of the fields that often lead better lives. For the burden of humanity is the burden of judgment. It is the inky blackness of your heart that doesn't judge others, but judges yourself. And on closing government, we say that the better way to reconcile religion is not to see yourself as a person who takes advantage of illusions, who takes the burden of thought by yourself, but as a child, lost and untethered at birth. I want to first begin by analyzing the poems and contrasting what Vespers and what I think OO gets right is that on opening opposition, you choose to believe in God. But why do you choose to believe in God? Because you choose to believe in God by looking at a pasture of fire, a show of violent power and the majesty of creation. But the problem, creation's power groans not just with glory, but gore as well. Tsunamis that kill entire coastal towns, plagues that destroy the pastures of people that God supposedly created. But also, I think the problem with opening half is that people somehow see these poems as an instruction manual. That's just not true. Disillusioned Christians do not look at these instruction manuals as instruction manuals for life. They are instruction manuals for the heart. They look at these poems and ask themselves, how does this reflect my struggle with God? Because art isn't about convincing yourself that God is real. It is about convincing you that you are real, that everything you feel is your own, and that your love for God and the cry for help that you feel each and every day is reasonable. CG is going to explain three things. First, why disillusioned Christians are exhausted, why they want the metaphor of a child. Second, why the second poem, like more likely and greatly, like leads to the struggle of the problem of evil and exacerbates that. And lastly, why the sacrilegious nature of the second poem makes you feel far more socially isolated. First, why are disillusioned Christians exhausted? Disillusioned Christians do not want to have constantly been able to take the fight of faith to themselves. And here, I want to explain why they're tired. Because you spend your entire life fighting for yourself, but not just for yourself, but with yourself. Because you often believe that you badly want to believe. You spend your whole life reading and trying to look for a reason that God is real. And at the end of the day, then, you sit down and read poetry. The mask comes off and you are exhausted. You spend your whole life looking at evidence for God. You read and reread the Bible, and you hug your gay friends that much tighter. But read the poem panel. The second poem is so fucking complicated. What the fuck does the wax of blueberry or dingleberry change anything? But the field of fire changes it instead. It requires you to be able to choose to fool yourself and explicitly say, I am not a child. But what does the Bible say? The Bible says that you can't enter the kingdom of heaven unless you have the heart of a child. The caller, on the other hand, looks at your exhaustion and says, come, child, I know your desperation. I know how lost you are, and this may not happen, but this is what you want as a disillusioned Christian oh so badly. This is why opening opposition talking about the formal elephants just means nothing to the desperate Christian. A shorter poem is just significantly better. A poem that tells you about how sad, how tired, how lonely you are, and how you don't want to fight against yourself and your society anymore. That is the biggest feeling that the disillusioned Christian feels, and the metaphor of a child fits that just so much better. Just want to take a look at the side note as well. Like, the King James Bible is quite well read by Christians, so I think they're quite familiar with archaic language. Second extension, Christians struggle greatly, but what do they primarily struggle greatly with? They struggle with the problem of evil. The reality then is that the poem of the second poem, Vespers specifically, attempts to show this by looking at the beauty and majesty of God's creation, the theological gift, the pasture of fire, the red sun, the idea that God is in the wind. But this is an absolute mockery to the struggles that you feel. Because why are you even disillusioned? You are disillusioned because you say, if God is all good and all powerful, why on earth do bad things happen to me and your family? He asks you, why did he let your mother die? Is this a test? Why or why not? And the problem then is the second poem actively throws in your face that God is everywhere, that God is all powerful, that he was supposed to create the big burning fire in the sky. And if that is true, why didn't he solve it? Why didn't he help you? And I think that is the big problem that the opposition bench faces, that it doesn't actually reflect the way that you view God in your heart. The fact is that he is constantly allowed you to suffer. The second poem, Vespers, is a thinky poem. It says, look at the beauty of the earth and see that God is good, or that he might exist. But the earth isn't good and the earth isn't beautiful, and you know that deep down. The first poem, on the other hand, talks about every struggle and talks about why precisely you had a hard time leaving your faith. I think this is the difference. The first poem specifically looks at the reasons why you haven't left the faith just yet. It talks about the fact that as you raved and grew fierce and wild, that you realized that your life was just so much more meaningless, that you couldn't find a meaning in the fight, that it made it that much harder for you to understand yourself. And it shows to you in the end why you feel like this. And it shows to you what you wanted so deeply, but maybe you don't get. But at the very least, you see that in yourself. You see and feel seen and heard as to why you haven't left in the first place. I'll take the POI. Go on.
Yeah, so I think that you totally misread Vespers. It's not one where you're certain that God exists and is good as in nature. It's one where you're uncertain about God's existence. You are asking through apostrophe for him to reveal yourself, and there's a tension between you seeing him in nature, but you also being unsure. I think this uncertainty is much better and captures your current state and enables us to access our impact.
But why are you uncertain? You're not uncertain because you didn't see God in a mulberry bush. You're uncertain.
I've paused. Gareth froze for 1 second there.
Same here.
So, right, I paused you at like 5:53 or so, and you just asked the question, why are you uncertain?
Is this good again?
Yeah, you're good now. Oh, he's frozen again.
Frozen again for me.
Certain because you feel scared about the earth. And what that means is that their version of uncertainty doesn't change. But also, like, the poem says that you like force your illusion onto yourself, right? And that's kind of bad as well. Third claim, that the poem of the second kind is sacrilegious. And the reality then is that as a disillusioned Christian, what you have to do is, if you are disillusioned, you end up leaving many of the people in your church that are still your friends, your mother, your father, your friends in many of the cases. The reality then, the second poem is sacrilegious because it tells you that you're literally just deluding yourself into believing that God is real. But that means you feel that much more alone, because the average person who's disillusioned doesn't leave the church. They just realize that they're stuck and trapped because of the social relations that they have. And because people are social creatures, they feel that much more alone in the church because they believe that they are the only ones who are trying to fake and pretend the fact that God is real, even if they don't necessarily believe it. Because this is important. Because you stand alone at the altar, your priest who's baptized you before, you know he probably has felt that religion is too much, but you don't necessarily believe that he has believed or tricks himself into God is real. Panel, the most faithful words of the Bible are Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Vespers forces you not just to forsake your God, but to forsake yourself. We're very proud to stand on closing government.
Thanks, Member Gov. Now, Member Ball.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Perfect. I do prefer POIs in the chat. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. First, a quick overview. I think both OO and CG have talked a lot about the form of the poem and what it takes. I think you're probably a reasonably intelligent person who is preferring a poem based off of like what we argue is the interpretation, not whether or not you can interpret it to begin with. I think that this is really important. A couple framing questions. First, what does the struggle actually look like? We agree with largely the rest of this debate, and we think that this is probably a crisis of faith. But when are you actually likely to have a crisis of faith? I think this is likely to occur when something is testing you, like a loved one is sick or something terrible is happening in your life and God isn't doing anything to prevent it, so you feel like he does not exist at all. There's much less of a reason for you to question if God is real when things are actually going well, which means that I think that it is fair to assume that this person is going through quite a hard time in their life and has real reasons to question why God is not helping. Second, framing question, what does it mean to prefer? I think you probably prefer feelings of comfort and relatability. Why? I think you are likely to have been socialized as a Christian because that's how the majority of people in the Christian faith come to that faith. Those around you are unlikely to be relating to your struggle, and that's why you are looking to these poems for solace to begin with. I also think that, as CG correctly points out, you are likely feeling alone, but I'm going to mechanize this too as to why. Religions are structurally designed to shame people who don't believe because they need people to partake in their religion and they don't want these feelings spreading. They want to silence people who are having a faith crisis out of fear that it will spread, and thus when you talk to your religious leaders, they're likely to tell you to sit down and shut up, to not actually vocalize these feelings and make you feel more alone, because that doesn't actually resolve the real questions you have. I think when you're looking to a poem, you're looking for something that validates your feelings so you feel less alone. This deep loneliness and invalidation from your community is actively existential. Those who you trust, your religious leaders, are telling you that your feelings are not valid. Those around you, your parents who have probably socialized you into Christianity to begin with, and those who you love are also likely telling you that your feelings are not valid. This is how people fall into depression and self-isolation. It's how they stray further away from their communities and their faith, which turns all of opening government's impacts. This is especially important given the framing that you are likely currently in a stressful, dark time outside of your crisis of faith, i.e. someone is sick, i.e. something bad has happened to you. Given that you are feeling this deep loneliness, why is Vespers' poem preferable? First, on relatability. Vespers feels more true because there is silence. For people struggling with disillusionment, the whole problem is that they don't hear God. Vespers' poem illustrates both the darkness of people who are struggling, but it's also parried with brief glimpses of light, i.e. it's not all dark until it becomes light. You feel both. You feel a push and a pull. Here's a quote. Even as you appeared, Moses, I live essentially in darkness. This is i.e. to say that you can still see God. It's not completely lost. You're not like in the first poem, completely in darkness, but you still have this crisis of faith. This is a far more controlling link to relatability than the language and the way it's written that OG tries to say. I think it's about the meaning of the poem and the emotions you are feeling, because you are very easily able to like look up a dictionary in order to figure out how things are written. Given that you are struggling, you still haven't found a resolution yet. So anything that assumes a clear resolution is just not going to be relatable. A poem is unlikely to be the tipping point on you suddenly finding a resolution for your crisis of faith. I think we can be a little bit realistic here. The mix of yearning to believe in God, but also suspicious of God, is what makes this poem, our poem, Vespers' poem, super relatable to disillusioned people. The first poem doesn't resolve the struggle. The speaker admits, I lived essentially in darkness. That's like an honest in our world, the speaker admits, I live in essentially darkness. That's more of an honest description of what a disillusioned Christian is likely to feel like. It's the silence of God, it's the lack of certainty, and that suspicion and despair is the only time that God stirs. I'll take a POI from opening if there is one. Seeing none, I'll continue. The caller, I think, is actively invalidating. God's voice is crystal clear. This poem is pretty, but it's not the common experience of disillusioned believers who often feel unsure whether what they sense is God, imagination, or nothing at all. I think our poem is far more likely to help them see God in the little things, on the hike to pick up blueberries. Most people won't be able to hear God in the way the first poem says, even like metaphorically. So to the average person having a crisis of faith, it's terminally unrelatable, and thus Gov doesn't get any of their impacts. Believing and relating is a prerequisite to the poem actively impacting your behavior. So why is the caller actively invalidating? In the church, you are told time and time again to just believe, but this is not helpful and actively invalidating with people of legitimate crisis of faith. In the caller, the faith crisis is just immediately silenced. I think that's why our poem is also more preferable in a more long-term manner. Even if you take Gov at their highest ground and say that this solves your faith crisis in the moment, it's likely your faith crisis will come back. It will never fully be silenced, as the poem implies, and thus you lose the relatability and its value. I'll take a POI from opening. I'll take a POI from closing.
Yeah, nobody is looking at these poems as a way to regain their faith. The question is, what do people desire in their hearts the greatest? And therefore, that is why the first poem about being a child because you are tired is far better at allowing you to see yourself in the poem rather than picking blueberries for some reason.
How are you a child when your mother is dying of cancer, when your child has died or you have just lost a job? I don't think people want to be infantilized. In fact, I think people want to feel relatability, but I also think that that's separate from your crisis of faith. The question is what's best for your crisis of faith. I don't think that's actually comparative. Relatability is probably the most important part of what you prefer. OG tells you that their poem makes you feel better because you believe it's true, but you're already questioning. You're likely to have been told to just have faith. The question has to be believable and relatable. This is a prerequisite to any sort of relief, which is also a prerequisite to feeling like a child because you have to be able to believe the message of the poem in order for it to grant relief. OG also just asserts that you are not able to relate to suffering, but I actually think it's super likely that you experience suffering and charged feelings, which makes our poem far more relatable via their own analysis. Lastly, I think closing government here is totally off base. I don't think that you feeling like a lost child is actually helpful to someone actively in a crisis of faith. You have real world problems. You are not a child. You are an adult with real problems, and being infantilized is more likely to push you away because it is invalidating, because it says you need to shut up and accept him regardless of your real life, which means that you are likely to be pushed away. And it's all the analysis I gave you above about what the church is already saying to you, that you just have to have faith and believe and you should not talk about it. CG also tries to say that Vespers' poem begs the question of why God hasn't helped you, but I think it's the opposite. The caller begs the question of why God hasn't spoken to you. Vesper never implies that God can have the power to help with day-to-day struggles. I think they're really off base in their interpretation. CG is making a lot of assertions here while never actually quoting from the poems and giving textual analysis as to where their points come from. I think this is true for every other team on the bench. Ask them to cite their sources. So proud to oppose.
Thanks, Member Ball. Now, God bless.
Hi, can everybody hear me if I speak like this?
Yeah.
Thank you. Just give me 1 second. I'll take POIs in chat, please. The first thing that I want to do in this speech is rebuild Garrett's extension on exhaustion and the imagery of childhood, because I think CO completely misses the point when they say, well, what's the point of being a child because you don't want to be infantilized? There are 3 reasons why this imagery is so significant to people who are struggling with their religious faith who are Christian. First, as Garrett points out, the imagery of childhood purifies the relationship between you and God, because it restores the innocence that many Christians believe they had in a relationship that existed before the Adamic fall, when you were without sin and when God still valued and cherished you as a child and not as an adult. This is why the verbs of frustration that I used, and they say we don't have textual analysis. When you say that in the first person you struck the board, that you raved and grew fierce and wild, this is why that frustration expressed in that way is so important in the collar, because it dismisses your religious guilt over the frustrations that you have over religious belief as being those akin to the childhood tantrums that you might have had. This is significant because it might seem like it minimizes your suffering, but actually what it does is it relieves you of the guilt that you feel over this religious frustration in the first place. The intuition here is this motion is not about somebody who has struggled with their faith and left the church. It is with a disillusioned Christian who still wants to remain a part of the faith, which is presumably why they're seeking out like metaphysical poetry from the 1600s for some glimpse of faith. So purifying this relationship matters. But secondly, it relieves your burden, because now you no longer believe that the impetus is on you to try to manufacture a relationship with God through trying to marvel at his creation and find him in like the daffodils or like the fiery fields, because God speaks to you eventually. Maybe not in the moment of your suffering, but eventually he acknowledges you as your child. This promise of salvation is what has driven people towards the Christian faith, despite the fact that God probably never actually speaks to them, has committed them to a religious lifestyle despite the many sacrifices. So we do think that this promise of salvation and reaffirming it through reading this poem is significant. But the third reason why is it allows people to sit with their ignorance. The fundamental problem of evil is that we will never know the mind of God. We will never understand why bad things happen to good people. But if we allow ourselves to believe that we are as children and God as our parent, then it means that the bad things that happen to us do have a meaning, do have a purpose. This means that, akin to something like vaccination, the bad things that we go through are part of a bigger plan, which is already a dominant belief in the Christian faith, which is why the imagery of childhood in the college is so significant, which is why it actually first fills the gap in the opening government case, because they just talk about this reaffirming you and making you feel less guilty because it's relatable without ever actually analyzing how that process occurs, but responds directly to closing opposition because the isolation that you feel is best relieved on our side of the house. And I want to respond directly to closing opposition. They say that religions are structurally isolating because you don't hear God. Well, the first thing that I want to point out is that in moments of divine intervention and religious hysteria, which I think opening government points out is the likely counterfactual, you do believe that you hear God. But they don't actually analyze why this is the likely counterfactual and how this comes about, which is what I'll actually do. We think that the reason that people interpret moments of religious hysteria as divine intervention are manifold. The first is there are evolutionary reasons for, like, if you believe like religion is something that people were socially evolved into, believing in because it was a useful social tool to bind groups with one another, then surely there is some evolutionary and biological basis in this. This is why many people report seeing angels, for example. This is why people are so vulnerable to things like visual and auditory hallucination and illusions. But secondly, deep religious study and meditation evokes the kinds of thoughts that you believe come from a presence outside of you. Like we already see this all the time in secular life, right? Like, people who study subjects have eureka moments where ideas just come to them. We think that the process of like divine intervention that religious people go through is quite similar as well. But thirdly, it doesn't matter if you don't hear God, because this is about hope. And here's where the critical framing in Garrett's speech becomes so important, because he says that this literature is not about like an instruction manual that tells you what to believe, but rather it is a reflection of what you already value. So when reading this poem, you believe that eventually you will hear the voice of God, that what you want is to hear the voice of God. Because, and this is additional, we think that the way in which religious people consume art is uniquely not just as a form of like secular enjoyment, which is why the stuff on like whether or not this is a better poem is quite marginal, but also as a reaffirmation of your beliefs and as a process akin to prayer itself. Because think about it. Why do most like religions ban art like Islam, for example? Because they consider it heretical as distracting people from the faith. So it follows then that religions that do allow art to exist consider that to be a form of devotional art akin to prayer, which is why it's so important that the caller it actually reaffirms the ideas that exist within religion, rather than almost being borderline blasphemous, as in the second poem, when you are told that actually all religion is just self-delusion in disguise. So that framing becomes even more important in this case. Finally, they say it's relatable. I actually think that's a bad thing. Like, if you can relate with self-delusion, that just weakens your religious faith and makes you struggle even more. You now think that, again, as per our framing of how people view religious art, every time you engage with this art, you're just reaffirming the self-delusion that pushes you even further away from religion. But if you want like structural reasons for this, I would point out that, George Herbert is also like a significant religious figure. Like, he was himself like a man of the cloth. He was a very significant figure in like 16th century religious reformation in like Elizabethan England. All of these are also additional reasons why distancing yourself from the first poem means that you feel more distance from the faith. They say that people will continue to struggle with the faith on our side of the house. Good, because we think that struggle with the faith is one of the pillars of religion. When you know that you are struggling, but you keep pulling yourself back to God because you eventually think that you will hear his voice, that is when you believe that you are a good Christian. Everyone struggles, but it is about acknowledging that religion is not self-delusion. I'll take opening.
Yeah, so the issue with your entire case is that it hinges on a one-liner about my child, which Christians will hear in literally every other aspect of this faith. But the dominant imagery in the poem is not child, but about bodily deprivation, dryness, drowning, and blood.
So I'll talk about that as well, because we think that that adds to the religious imagery. First of all, child is the last word. It's a pretty significant word. It's the moment that God speaks to you. It's the one word he says. People will interpret this significantly, so that's a lie. But secondly, we think that the kind of suffering and frustration that the caller talks about is actually the good kind of frustration and suffering. And here's what I weigh directly against opening government. Because we think that what's missing from opening government is the textual analysis. The imagery in the caller is that of material and worldly suffering, which we think corresponds quite significantly to our analysis on isolation. Because one of the ways in which people feel isolated is that they feel that the struggles that they're going through in everyday life don't actually correspond quite well with like what religion is trying to console them with. But when you see like the material struggles of things like the garlands and not being able to get like the thorn, the cordial fruit, the imagery of the wine, all of these are things that religion distances you from, because you are told that you are not of this world and not material to it. So for those reasons, we think that we actually close the hole in the opening government case by proving how this solves people's problems of isolation. We also respond directly to opening opposition because we prove that the counterfactual is actually one in which you have these problems for these reasons. CG.
Thanks, Goblet. And now Opera.
There's a really important line in Raina's speech, which is, I think, probably the controlling link into the rest of the round, and it's why CO is going to take the one in this round. And that is that relatability and not being disillusioned or turned off immediately by reading the poem is the prerequisite for any feeling that results post-internalizing the poem. So in order for you to feel the relief, in order for you to feel like a child and not being exhausted, in order for you to internalize the poem and then go on and have that internalization affect all of your actions after that, you need to actually be able to sit down and look at the poem and not immediately stop reading it or not take the time to think about the poem like for an hour like we've all just done. And in order for that to happen, you need to feel as though you relate to the poem, as if you can actually understand, and this validates your own feelings inside of you. Our argument is that you never get to the Gov's benefits of happiness and reading after reading Collar, because you read Collar and do not relate or feel as though it is a good conclusion. Collar tells you that the solution to your disillusionment is to have God simply remind you of existence, that he calls you a child and your issues are resolved. But notably how this runs into some issues. The first is that disillusioned Christians might not feel God at all, so if they do not relate to the resolution of Collar, they get no solace. The resolution of Collar is that once you hear God, your problems are solved. But for the people who feel as though they do not hear God at all, there's just no resolution whatsoever, and then these people are left to the wayside. The second issue is that just because you feel God as an existential person does not mean that you don't still have anger and questions about God, so it's not a good conclusion. Now see, G tells you that, if you read the poem, you want to hear the voice of God, and sure, but hearing God does not solve your anger at God for your life themselves having suffering in it. And notably also, I think there's a uniqueness question where there are multiple often passages in the Bible where God appears or does a miracle, and that is enough for someone to believe in him. Versus Vespers provides a unique poem where you actually feel as, this is not just a regular sermon that I'm hearing in church about how God appears and then that solves all of my problems. This is actually relating to my current issues and the very same questions that I am asking right now. That is what Vespers is relating to me right now. What does Vespers do? It acknowledges that you can feel God and actually see his presence, but that does not mean that your issues with God are resolved. And it allows people to not feel shame about having questions about God, which is the exact rhetoric that CG uses when they get up there and say that it is sacrilegious and blasphemous to have these questions about God. It is not sacrilegious to have this internal tension where you're questioning whether God is real, but you still want God to be real because it would make you feel better to feel that. That internal war is likely something that a disillusioned Christian is feeling right now when they are turning to solace for these poems. And that's why the resolution as Vespers is so much better than Collar, because it is relatable and does not immediately turn off a disillusioned Christian from internalizing the poem in the first place, which is necessary to feel any of the impacts. Now, on CG, their argument is that you are, one of their arguments is that you are searching for something in this poem, that you want to feel relief because you're coming at this from a place of exhaustion. And we agree, but we think that what you're really looking for is validation. That validation that gives you the same relief as being called a child, because we think that Vespers tells you that you are actually correct for feeling disillusioned, and we're not going to shame you for it. Many other people who are also disillusioned have also had these same questions. And we think that when you do not feel shame for your questions, when you're not told that it is sacrilegious to have questions about your faith, that you are actually more likely to remain in the church. I'll take the POI from OG.
Panel, please note that the entire bench of opposition is contingent on the fact that you'll simply be able to look at the sunset and feel or see the presence of God. This is a matter that's been asserted and never proven in both OO and CO.
Wait. Our resolution is not that you look at the sunset and see God, and notably, your resolution is that God speaks to you and says, "My child." Both of them probably seem equally unlikely to actually, quote-unquote, happen. Our resolution is that if it is true, let's move away from the literal words of the poem. Our resolution is that if it is true that you see God around you, whether that's in nature, whether that's God talking to you, your feelings don't just, your feelings of anger at knowing that God is real, but still being angry and disillusioned, that is okay. And we just validate the fact that you can both believe in God and see signs of him existing and still go to church, but still have questions, that you are a good Christian for still having questions and still feeling anger at God. That is the message of Vespers. We don't need to actually see God in a blueberry bush for him to be real or not, or to take meaning away from the poem. Now, on to CG. I want to clarify one thing really quickly. They say that, when you hear God, you don't believe that the impetus is on you and that God speaks to you, and that's what brings people to salvation. But notably, Vespers still have moments of God existing and speaking to you, so the impetus is not on you to decide whether God exists or not at all, but just about what you want your relationship to God to actually be. Secondly, they said that the counterfactual is hysteria, and that evolutionary, mechanisms and deep religious studies often have you go into this hysteria. I think this is a super high burden, and that they need to prove that you are likely experiencing hysteria in order to do this. I think it is our framing about who are the people who are likely to do this. I don't think that the counterfactual is hysteria. I think that the counterfactual is likely just a loss of faith and feeling sad if you do not go into God, or continue having faith in God. With that then, what is also our weighing on why we think that we weigh over OO? OO's argument is that when you internalize Vesper and feel God is distant, you do better self-actualization because you choose your relationship with God, and thus you're able to pursue more activities. First, I think that we think that short-term relatability is probably more important than long-term action. The prerequisite analysis that I already said, you need to be able to relate to it in order to continue reading it, continue thinking about it, and continue internalizing it, so you can't do anything else before you've actually read it. But second, I think that when someone is in crisis, they don't usually think in terms of what lesson is going to help me in 10 years. They need language for their pain today. And so relatable poetry validates their emotions immediately and helps them survive the moment and not necessarily thinking, well, now that I've decided to be distant with God, I can go hug my gay friend, which is their argument. But second, I think that stopping the feelings of immediate loneliness on our side prevents depression and isolation, which comes prior to your future relationship with God. The OO impact lacks urgency or relevance. Right now, you're in a serious situation and feeling abandoned or depressed, and it's uncertain which way this crisis of faith actually takes you. But what is certain is that you need immediate relief, and we think that we get that on our side of the house when we validate your crisis of faith with God. Very proud to oppose.
Thanks, everyone. Please leave the room for about 15 minutes. Okay, we can take a couple of minutes to come to our initials, and Daz can leave the room since I assume they are not a judge. And I also assume recording can stop unless